I mean, one of the things that certainly is paramount in this industry is the reputation of the firm and the issue of reputational risk, which is very difficult at times to make sure you're managing and controlling. So how does this, positively impact their ability to control, negative press or issues that may impact their reputations negatively?
Sure. I mean, some of that comes down to the compliance risk that firms are subject to more now than ever, and part of the challenge there is to make sure that there's consistency in what they're telling investors in meetings, consistency in what they're telling investors in their documents, consistency in reporting, and so that's part of being institutional or being institutional quality, is to make sure you have process and control set up internally so that whatever gets distributed from an investor relations perspective has already been reviewed by compliance or others to make sure it's consistent with other information that's being reported to the regulators or otherwise.
One of the other things we see around reputational risk is we're seeing it demanded by the investors. So in the area of people, we see investors looking at transparency in terms of how you're rewarding people, to what extent do they have ownership in the funds that we're investing in, what's the diversity of your team look like, even things such as to what extent are you training your people. So we're seeing transparency and in many ways, and investors actually looking at the reputation of the firm.
And another way that firms manage reputation is by looking at reporting externally to their stakeholders, so reporting to their investors, to their regulators, and having some control over that and thinking about what they want to report and the controls that they have in place.
So maybe sticking with that for a moment, Melanie, if you think about controls and enhanced controls, documenting controls, reporting controls, what is changing from that perspective, and where is that changing?
I think firms are definitely more focused on it. Historically, they've been focused on really the books and records and controls over operations. I think firms are really looking broader than that and looking at other areas, whether it's compliance and risk management, and looking at the controls there. Also realizing there's a lot of interplay in controls between the functions. So how do you, build the overall control environment that makes sense and have the right controls throughout it and not just within specific business lines, and definitely building scalability into those controls. As you have more funds, as you have more investors, how do you have scalability across the controls?
You have to remember that firms have always had controls, and they need controls, frankly, to get past the first day of their operations. The question is whether those controls are manual, whether they're, frankly, individual dependent, whether they're repeatable, scalable, and documented so that they could be evident. So we've often seen our clients who have controls. The question is whether they're evidenced in a way that investors, regulators, or even auditors could assess.
So maybe a final thought before we wrap up. Sean, maybe start with you.
I think as hedge funds institutionalize, they're going through a myriad of changes. These are changes across different functions as they invest in standard processes. They're moving from highly manual systems to automated solutions. They're scaling up in terms of upping their games in terms of capabilities as well as capacity. This represents a significant change that needs to be appropriately managed through the right communications, but also staying focused on the core business. Staying focused on driving those returns, as well as changing the fund at the same time. That's going to be a critical piece as our clients navigate this over the next 12 months.
Mike?
Yeah, I think firms need to do two things. They need to deliver performance to their investors, and they need to deliver confidence to investors, frankly, and to regulators. And so to do those things, they do need to balance being entrepreneurial and being institutional. But institutionalization is the term that people are using to encompass it all. It's having a sustainable, distinct advantage from an investment perspective, something that's repeatable from an investment perspective, but it's also having repeatable, scalable, sustainable processes from a back office perspective.
Melanie?
I think from an institutional perspective, firms really need to think about their controls, their processes, and how mature they are, and where, when they look across their stakeholders, and where they need to really focus, whether it's the regulator or their investors, and how do you make sure you have the right controls and processes in place, and are you, when we talk about cost, is it cost effective to do it, and how do you do it the right way?
And I think the title of the paper, From Good to Growth, this has been a very good industry. It has an opportunity to grow, and institutionalization will allow there to be value created for investors and for the owners of the businesses, which is really the important thing.